In terms of the fiscal deficit, the 2023 budget statement on a consolidated basis has actually outperformed the expectations that were expressed at the time of the 2022 MTBPS, that is the medium-term budget policy statement. The fiscal deficit on a consolidated basis now sits at around 4.2%, which actually outperformed the 4.9% that was expressed at the time of the MTBPS. This is largely on account of revenues which have outperformed and expenditures that have been able to be kept in kilter. In terms of the 2023 budget, very much as was expressed and in the objectives for the MTBPS, expenditures have been managed well. They have been kept within kilter, and no new expenditures have been announced, which is a very positive development. The only area of latitude, of slight latitude, was the fact that the social relief grant in the form of the COVID distress relief grant was extended by a further year until the 31st of March 2024. State revenues have actually outperformed in terms of the expectations that were expressed at the time of the MTBPS. The reasons for this are largely due to an increase in tax buoyancy. And what that means very simply is if we look at the change in tax revenues expressed over the change in GDP, then this metric as a whole has improved. Furthermore, in terms of corporate tax receipts, this was largely bolstered on account of the great number of mining tax receipts that were received over the course of this fiscal window on account of higher commodity prices. Also, incomes and profits have proved to be a lot more resilient than what was baked into expectations at the time of the MTBPS. The debt trajectory unfortunately deteriorated somewhat relative to the expectations that were expressed at the time of the MTBPS. So whereas at that time you had debt stabilizing, debt to GDP ratio stabilizing at around 70% in the 2022-23 fiscal window, that has now been pushed up, and debt stabilizes at about 74% of GDP in the 2025-26 fiscal window. One of the biggest areas of concern would be how the budget would treat support to struggling state-owned enterprises, foremost among them being Eskom. So what has now been tabled is a formal act, the Eskom Debt Relief Act, which is a bill that will essentially outline the ways in which National Treasury will support Eskom in the next 3 fiscal windows by a series of loans, which then become equity injections subject to very strict constraints that will be put on Eskom. Some of these constraints relate to Eskom not being able to issue new debt, Eskom being able to only use these injections for the purposes of servicing its own debt, and also Eskom not being able to use these funds to develop any greenfields electricity generation capability, and thereby moving reliance away from Eskom in terms of its overall share in terms of power generation. The global economic environment still finds itself on an extremely fragile footing on account of the process of policy normalization by key central banks. This process of policy normalization in general over the course of 2022 and 2023 has meant and has catalyzed a process of risk aversion on the part of global investors. What that generally means for emerging market bonds and currencies is that borrowing costs go up, and you sit with the prospect of having weaker local currencies, as we do here in South Africa. If that does happen, you'll find that borrowing costs in South Africa also go up, accompanied by a weaker rand. So this issue gets exacerbated when we have the prospect of poor electricity generation and very, very weak aggregate demand, which could then lead to lower tax receipts and lower growth overall. The other concern is the idea of the social wage bill. So whereas there's been fiscal prudence and fiscal constraint thus far, the general way in which this normally plays out is that the public sector normally wins out. In other words, government normally relents and grants the public sector the kind of wage agreements that they seek out. So if this does happen, this will obviously be budget negative, so that's one of the other areas to watch. The final area to watch will be whether there are other additional social grants, very much in the form of what we've seen being rolled out for COVID, if there are any additional social grants which are rolled out in this fashion, that could also be very, very negative for the fiscus and will basically curtail the kind of expenditure constraint that we've seen thus far.